In life, creepy people are in no short supply. Tonight, we're going to be delving into some stories about them. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon and like for more creepy content. I'd also like to thank Midnight Researcher for joining us in tonight's video. And finally, I have some words that I would appreciate you guys hear if you'd like to at the very end. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I am a 29-year-old female and was 21 and working for KFC as a manager when this occurred. I had the closing shift. Our store closed at 10 p.m. and I got out shortly after closing, which was pretty rare, but we had had an unusually quiet night. We had a lot of leftover chicken, and company policy was to throw it away. Now, my boyfriend worked for the state police headquarters in the city that we lived in, and was working nights. So I decided to bring him and his workmates the leftover chicken instead of just throwing it out. I still recorded the food as wasted and followed protocol, just accidentally put it in my car instead of the trash. It was a good 45-minute drive from the store I worked in to the city center where my boyfriend worked, but I blasted my music and just enjoyed the drive and de-stressed from a long day. I pulled up next to the side entrance to the police headquarters and messaged my boyfriend that I was there with some chicken. He replied that he wasn't actually in that building, but was helping out with some tech difficulties elsewhere. I knew the building he's at fairly well because he's worked there before, so I say I'd bring it over. This other building faces a large park that's in the middle of the city. The streets aren't particularly well lit or busy near this building, especially late at night, because there are no bars or restaurants, mostly office buildings and apartments. I park next to the side entrance/loading zone, but under a street light at the top of the street, and text my boyfriend that I'm here with the food. He says he'll be down in 15 minutes. He is just in the middle of something, and at this point, I've been in my car for over an hour or so I get out just to stretch a little. As soon as I do, I notice a person walking towards me. I can't quite tell if they are male or female because they are halfway down the street from where I am, and I'm in the light, and they are not. But I can see it's a pretty solid person, so I assume it's probably a man. This was confirmed 2 seconds after, when he calls out to me, "Hey beautiful, what you doing?" I immediately feel uncomfortable and don't reply. I reasoned that if I ignored him and don't give him the attention he's after, he'll probably just leave me alone. Oh, how wrong I was. He keeps calling out to me, and I decide to ignore him. He's still a fair distance off, but closing in on me, so I decide to get back in my car. I figure I want something in between him and I. As soon as I open my door, he runs straight up to me. I jump in my car and lock it immediately. He gets to my car astonishingly fast. I drop my keys on the floor in a panic to try and start it to drive away. He tries to open my door, realizes it's locked, and then just starts punching my door and screaming at me. I am crying at this point and frozen in fear. He's hitting my car with such force that he cracks my windscreen, and I start to scream in terror that he's going to break through and get to me. He must have split open his hand on his assault of the car, because at this point there is also blood all over it. The whole time he's punching it, he's screaming at me, "I want it. I know you want it. Stop being such a cow." I'm close to hysterics, and then suddenly he stops screaming and presses his face up on the window and is just staring at me. I am avoiding looking at him and desperately trying not to give in to full-blown panic. His face disappears, and I hear other voices now. My boyfriend and his co-worker have come down to retrieve the chicken, and the guy just legs it into the darkness of the park. My boyfriend is a big dude, and works for police but isn't actually a police officer. However, the uniform he wore for work was really similar, and in the dark you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference, so that's probably what made him leg it. I made a statement to police, but he was never caught, or if he was, I was never told. Hands down, the scariest encounter I've ever had.
My hometown is pretty small. So small, I ran into this man on 3 separate occasions. I remember being 8 or 9 when this happened. My younger brother and I had stayed behind in the previous aisle playing with the small toy section. My mom had immediately called for us to follow her. My brother and I ran back to the shelf, threw our toys down, and ran as fast as we could down the aisle. We rounded the corner, he rounded it tighter, and I did a wider turn. My brother was able to keep running on. I, however, ended up running into this tall, big, burly man. He just stared down at me. Even at that age, I remember thinking he looked like he wasn't completely there. He didn't talk to me, and the look on his face was weird. I apologized and I ran back to my mom. For the rest of the time at the market, I remember constantly seeing him around. He'd be at either end of the aisle, or he'd be across the market, always looking my way. His stare made my skin crawl. When we exited the market, he was standing at the door, just staring. I've had so many nightmares of this market. I can still remember the cold, gray concrete flooring and the exact layout. It terrifies me just thinking about it. I had begged my mom for us to never go there, and I remember either always staying home if she went there, or she would avoid that market if I was with her. I saw him twice more after this. This time I was 12. My mom and I had went to a fast food restaurant that was in the shape of an L, except flipped. The shorter part of the restaurant, the bottom, was the cashier part, and the longer part was the seating. There were 2 entrances, one at the end of the longer part, and one right in the corner, where the shorter part meets the longer part. We had parked and entered the top of the L. We sat down right near the door, and she said she would go order the food. As she was walking away, I see the door at the other end swing open, and in walks the same man from the market. He looked exactly the same as I remembered in my nightmares. He was headed to the cashier when he turned his head and looked down the aisle. He looked at me and immediately changed course. He was headed straight to me. He took a seat 2 tables ahead of me. He sat so we were directly facing each other. I grabbed my mom and told her I didn't want her to go. I told her that there was that man I hated so much, the one who had terrified me when I was a little kid. We sat there for a few minutes while she calmed me down and told me we would just quickly get up and head straight for the car. I remember I looked at her, and then I saw his head poke to the side. He wanted me to see him. He had the same look on his face. His eyes were wide open, and he looked slack-jawed. We quickly got up and left that place. The last time I saw him, I'm not sure what age I was, maybe around 12 also. We had merged onto the freeway as I looked to my left. The man is driving. He looked over at me, immediately smiling when he saw my face. I told my mom he was driving next to us, and she quickly got off at the next turn and drove all around the town so he wouldn't be able to keep up with us. At the time, I wasn't sure if he was following us, but asking my mom years later, she confirmed he did follow us around the town. I'm glad I don't remember much of that, but I think it was because my mom told me to keep my head down. I can still see him, as clear as day. I remember running into him. I remember the fear and the fright he gives me. I think what scared me the most about him was that he looked very off. Like there was no line he wouldn't cross to come and take me. He had no issue staring right into my eyes, letting me know he wanted me. I'm thankful my mom always took my pleas very seriously.
A long time ago, in the mid-1970s when I was about 17, I was at the mall arcade just horsing around playing games and riding on the bumper cars. The man was 2 cities away from where I lived, in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area. I knew lots of kids who hung out there, but since we all lived in a distance from this particular mall, we weren't friends away from the arcade. I only knew people there by the first name and maybe what city they lived in. More commonly, we each knew which kid was the best at which video game. I remember talking to a man outside the arcade who used to ask me very general questions like, "Did you run out of quarters? Shouldn't you be home studying?" I was wearing a t-shirt with my first name on it, but he never called me by my name. He was an adult. I thought he might even be a cop, but as I wasn't doing anything wrong, that part didn't worry me. My mum had dropped me off there, and she picked me up later to bring me home, so I really doubt that he followed me. In fact, I forgot all about him within an hour. About a week later, that man phoned me. Now that scared the living crap out of me. Back when we only had landlines, and I'm 100% certain I didn't give it out to him. I don't remember ever telling this man my surname, and if I had, my surname was different from my mother's, whose name was on the phone bill and in the phone book. I was at home alone when he called. The man was nice, but the situation was so off I was panic-stricken. He said he wanted to make sure I was okay. I asked him how he got my phone number. He just replied, "It wasn't difficult," and then the line cut.
To start off, let me say that I had a rather sheltered childhood. My dad was in the military, so my family lived on an army base, which is sort of like an ultra-gated community. Anyone coming in through the gates had to show ID, and it was pretty much insulated from the rest of the city that had surrounded it. Because of this, I had a lot of freedom to explore and spend time outside, unsupervised. That's why I find it especially strange that I had this encounter on summer day in my pre-adolescence, about 12 years ago. On the base that I lived in, there was a public pool where we could go most days during the summer. It was pretty large, and its main attraction were the 3 different slides that it had. I just passed the swim test that was required in order to ride the largest slide, so I was extra eager to go to the pool that day. Our family friends lived down the street, and they had several children. 2 of the girls were close to my age, and they had an older brother who was going to drive us all to the pool for that day. They literally lived about 9 houses down the road, so I donned my one-piece bathing suit and flip-flops, wrapped a towel around my waist, and grabbed my pool bag under my arm so I could head over and start the day. One important detail is that I wore glasses at the time. I got them when I was around 9, and my vision wasn't too terrible back then, though it's gotten a lot worse in the years since. I was too young to have contacts at the time, so I would just leave my glasses at home so that I wouldn't lose them at the pool. This had happened once before to me. I began my walk to my friend's house. As I walked along the sidewalk, the row of houses was on my right, the street was to my left, and there was a parade field on the other side of the road. Since this was a main road, nobody was allowed to park on the street in front of the houses, and everyone would instead park on the service road behind them. This is why I noticed that a car passed me and parked right in front of my friend's house. I figured my friend's brother must have invited someone to the pool with us. I noticed someone get out of the car, and to my surprise, they didn't walk to my friend's house. They walked up the sidewalk towards me. As the person drew closer, I saw that it was a guy. That's really all I could see. It seemed to be an average height, somewhat skinny dude. Again, I kept thinking that it was my neighbor's friend, and he was going to ask me if he had the right house or something. He finally approached me, and all I remember being able to see about him was that he seemed relatively young and had brown hair. Honestly, at this point, I wasn't really thinking too much of it. "Hey," he said, "you going to the pool?" I remember kind of thinking, duh, since I was wearing my swimsuit and a towel, but I answered him with a yes. "Oh, cool, is it that big one with the curly slide?" he asked. I replied that it was, but there was another pool on the base that was smaller and had no slides, so I figured he was just trying to determine which one I was going to. "Really? I'm going there too. he said. "I can give you a ride if you want." His tone was friendly enough, but I instantly felt adrenaline surge through my body. I may have been a sheltered child, but this was the exact scenario that I had seen in countless movies and PSAs, and instantly I felt panicked. Some stranger asking me to get in the car with them was not something that I was dumb enough to accept, not after years of stranger danger conditioning. No thanks," I answered him. I remember straining to look at him to see some defining characteristic that I could tell my mom about later, but I was not about to get closer to him to get a better look, and all I could make out was brown hair, and that he seemed youngish. "Okay, well, would you be able to give me directions here then? If you come to my car, I have a map. You could show me the way," he said, nonchalantly. My panic instantly rose when he mentioned coming to his car, and it struck me as super strange that he apparently knew the pool I was talking about, offered to drive me there, but then suddenly claimed he didn't know where it was. All I could think about was getting away from him, so I just stammered, "No, I'm good. I'm riding with my friends, so I'll just go with them." He just said okay, and walked back to his car. I had to walk the same direction as him, but I cut diagonally through all my neighbors' yards, so that I wouldn't risk walking near his car. He reached his car and got inside, but he did not drive away. I remember wishing so badly that I could see the license plate, but that was way too far for my eyes to make out. As I walked to my friend's door, I knocked frantically and kept looking behind me to see that the car was still there. They answered in about 30 seconds, and as soon as they opened the door, he drove off. My friend's mom was the one who answered, and she could tell that something was wrong. I told her what had just happened, and I think that they ended up calling the local cops, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, the entire encounter really confuses me. The guy really didn't seem threatening, and when I told people that he seemed to be young, in his early 20s maybe, everyone just kind of brushed it off. But I just can't imagine anyone having good reasons for inviting an unknown 11-year-old girl into their car. Either your intentions are bad, or you're so incredibly stupid that you don't realize how creepy you are. I guess I'll never know what was up with that guy, but I'll happily never meet him again.
This takes place a few years ago, when I was 16 to 17 years old. I am a 22-year-old female now, and used to work at a well-known fast food restaurant. I typically had to work the closing shift, since I had school earlier in the day, so by the time I got home, it was around 11:30 p.m. I had my own car at this time, and when I got off work, I used to like to sit in my car, recline the driver's seat back, and listen to music and just chill out. I used to do this because I have helicopter parents, so this was the only real alone time I got without being hovered around. Well, one night, I was exhausted. I got stuck with the slow closers, so I got home a little later than normal. I started up my normal routine of sitting in my car, but instead of listening to music and scrolling through my phone, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep or anything. I was just listening to myself breathe while taking in the silence of my own company. I don't remember how long I was laying back with my eyes closed, but suddenly I bolted up and saw my mum with an angry face waving frantically at me. She was gesturing at me to come to her immediately. I sighed and hurried out the car towards her. I would like to add my parents liked to drink, so she was pretty inebriated when I approached her. She grabbed me by the shoulders and hissed, "Who is out here with you?" Confused, I shook her off. "No one, Mum. I was sitting in the car by myself before I came in." I remember feeling a little annoyed, because I thought I was going to get in trouble, but her face soon turned from angry to concerned. "What? Someone was out here. They were looking at you through the window. I came out here because I had a funny feeling, and when they saw me, they took off into the neighbor's yard." She was slurring her words together terribly and was visibly shaking. Being the teenager that I was, I just rolled my eyes and took her inside. I just thought she was drunk and overprotective, as she got worried that I wasn't in the house at my normal time. When next morning rolls around, I do my normal school routine, kiss my parents goodbye, and as I'm unlocking my car door, I notice something that stops me dead in my tracks. I felt a cold sweat creep up on me, with a chill sliding down my spine. A forehead and 2 forearm prints were on my driver's side window. I never sat in my car after work again. I think about it from time to time, about what would have happened had my mother not come out to check on me. Were they looking into my car to break into it? Did they notice me completely defenseless and try to scare me? I have no idea. But I'm glad I never found out.
I've never really told anyone about this incident. In fact, I've tried pretty hard to forget about it, but since obviously that's not working, I might as well share it with you all. One summer night in 2006 or 2007, I was spending the night at my best friend's house. I would have been about 16 at the time, and she, we'll call her Casey, would have been about 18 or 19. We'd gotten bored with whatever we had been doing at her house for the last few hours and decided to venture out to the Denny's, a 24-hour diner for those of you who don't know, down the street from her house to get some grub. It was probably around 1 a.m. when we arrived at the restaurant. Things were fine for the first little while. We sat goofing off and being the obnoxious teenagers that I'm sure we were. After a while, I started to notice Casey got a little squirmy as she kept looking over my shoulder to the booth behind us. She gestured to her phone, letting me know to look at my own, and she would text me whatever it was that she didn't feel comfortable saying out loud. I gave her a minute to type it out, and waited for the little ding in my phone. I obviously can't remember exactly what it said, since this was nearly 10 years ago, but I remember her telling me that the guys in the booth behind me kept making eye contact with her and looking over at us. I faked a backstretch so I could look behind me without making it obvious. There were 2 guys in the early 20s, if I had to guess, sitting behind us, and as soon as I turned around, they took this as an invitation. They got up and walked over to our table and started asking if they could join us. Now, something you should keep in mind is that Casey and I were both pretty late bloomers when it came to boys at this age. At this point, I don't think either of us had ever had a boyfriend or done so much as make out with a boy. We were pathetically boy crazy because of this. Needless to say, when 2 young, not completely unattractive men were asking to join us, I don't think either of us even thought twice. They sat down with us and struck up some conversation about why we were out so late, asking if we'd been out partying or something. We said no, neither of us drank or did anything at all, self-proclaimed straight edge. They laughed and said they had been at a party or something and got bored with everyone, so they decided to bounce. We humored them with conversation for another half hour or so before deciding we should probably get back home. We paid our bill, said goodbye, and headed out to Casey's car. We paused outside for a moment, deciding what we should do for the rest of the night. As we're standing there discussing our plans, the 2 from inside exited the building. They asked us why we were still there, and we briefly mentioned we were figuring out what our plan was. One of them suggested we hang out with them for a while longer. Said they had a case of beer in the car, and maybe we could just go hang out at the park or something for a while. We hesitated at first, since this obviously didn't seem like a very smart idea, but this was the most attention either of us had gotten from a member of the opposite sex, pretty much ever. So we caved and agreed. We knew what park they were referring to and told them we would follow them over. They insisted that we not waste our gas and offered to let us ride with them. Why on earth we agreed to this, I will never know. To begin with, things were pretty harmless. I sat in the front seat with the driver, and Casey sat in the back with the more outspoken of the 2. He was definitely the instigator of this whole thing. The other just smiled and nodded most of the time. He was friendly and tried to keep me occupied with conversation as we drove. The music was turned up somewhat loud, so I didn't hear at first Casey's quiet objections coming from the back seat. It wasn't until she kicked the back of my seat that I turned around to see that the guy had his hands all over her and she was timidly pushing him away, just for him to immediately replace his hands on her leg. I started to get very nervous at this point. It suddenly dawned on me how massive of a mistake we had made. The driver reached between my legs and I went completely rigid. He laughed and told me to relax. He was only grabbing a beer. He grabbed a beer from the floor at my feet and cracked it open as he drove. I'm becoming more and more anxious, but we've already entered the park, and there was no way for us to get away without making a huge scene. This park ran along the length of a river, with somewhat thick woods on one side of the main road, and the river lining the other. The whole park is probably about 5 miles or so long. After driving several miles into the park, we pull into an empty parking lot of a dilapidated old city building. It had been used for Boy Scouts meetings and the like back in the early 60s, but now is repurposed as a meeting hall for receptions and parties, but very rarely. We get out of the car, and for the first time, I'm able to see how visibly shaken Casey is. We exchange one of those looks between best friends that requires no words. We needed to get the hell out of there. I start looking around our immediate area, attempting to figure out how we're going to get away from these two. I was starting to get that internal sense of dread. The parking lot was almost completely dark, except for one lamppost towards the front of the building. I had been to this building many times in the past, and I knew that behind the building was nothing but wooded trails and a creek that connected to the river eventually. I knew for a fact that there was no viable reason for us to go that direction. As soon as we exited the car, the one who had been in the back seat began grabbing Casey and trying to convince her that he wanted to show her something really cool behind the building. Casey was visibly panicking, but obviously didn't know how to tell him no. She starts laughing and picks up a stick off the ground, names it Stick Buddy, and continues to make jokes about Stick Buddy being scared of the dark and how much more he prefers it under the lamppost. A little bizarre, but hey, props for the creativity. In a pinch, I guess. The driver of the car keeps trying to pull me in the other direction. He hasn't touched me at all at this point, and I can tell he's a little hesitant about this whole thing. He starts to try and guide me away, and I resist, telling him I'm not leaving Casey alone. What's crazy is that this entire time, he's trying to apologize for his friend, saying, "Hey, I'm sorry about him, but everything is okay." I'm not buying it. As I turn around, I hear Casey call my name, and I can see that he has almost got her to the front of the building. At this point, the reality of the threat at hand has become very clear, and I start to get a little more belligerent about us not separating. I start to see headlights coming up the main road, and the driver noticed also. I think this is what spooked him, because he starts telling his friend that we should go, and it's not worth it. He gets visibly irritated and says, "Fine, forget it," and they begin to walk back to the car. Thank God, I think, as we get back into the car. We get back in, and the driver pulls out of the parking lot, but I know we're not out of the woods yet. In the back seat, the other guy still has his hands all over my friend. At this point, I am feeling lower than low. I should be standing up for my friend. I should be jumping in and telling him to get his grubby hands off of her, but I don't. I sit there, silently. I'm terrified by this point. These two could easily overpower me. Both of them had told us that they were soldiers in the military, and it was very clear how likely that actually was, just judging by how muscular they both were. I didn't know what to do by this point. I just kept telling the driver that we needed to get back to our car, that my dad was expecting us home by now, or something along those lines. Which, unfortunately, was total nonsense because no one even knew we left the house. I just wanted to get back to our car and forget any of this ever happened. The driver kept saying he would take us back soon, and everything was going to be just fine. As we turn onto the main road from the parking lot, I see headlights in the rearview mirrors, as if someone had just heard the pleas in my head. I see red and blue lights flicker on. We were being pulled over. The driver starts to panic about the fact that he's got 2 underage girls in his car and an open 24-pack of beer on the floor at one of their feet. He starts shoving beer into the back seat as we pull to the side of the road. I'm mentally preparing for how I'm going to let this officer know that we were in trouble. Just before the cop approaches the window, One of them tells us not to say a word, since they could get in a lot of trouble for this. Apparently that was enough for me to keep my teenage mouth glued shut, because I couldn't bring myself to say or do anything. The officer asks what we're doing in the park, after dark. The driver tells him we're just trying to kill some time and boredom, and we're just driving around. It was pretty clear the officer doesn't really believe him, but he likely just thinks we're out here drinking or smoking pot like most teenagers do. He doesn't ask for anyone else in the car's ID, just the driver's information. When he hands him his military ID, the cop hands it back, reminds him of the park's hours of dawn till dusk, and asked us to leave the property. The driver smiled, apologized, and thanked the officer. He told us to have a good night and went back to his car. I was so furious with myself for not being able to say anything. I felt like I had let my best friend down, and that if I had just been able to say something, this wouldn't be happening. My heart sank into my stomach as I watched the red and blue lights shrink in the distance, and we drove away from what seemed like our only safe haven at that moment. I made a joke about that being enough risk for me for one night and said it was probably best we should just get back to our car now. The one in the back started to protest, but the driver agreed and turned out of the park, heading back towards the restaurant. They dropped us off at our car and promptly disappeared into the night. Casey and I got back into our car, speechless, and drove back to her house. To this day, we very rarely bring up this incident. I think we're both just ashamed of how stupid we had been to put ourselves in that position in the first place. Although I never saw either of them after that night, Casey unfortunately did. We both worked in a department store portrait studio at that time, and a few weeks later, the one in the back seat came in to get family photos taken of himself, his wife, and his toddler. She contemplated telling his wife about what happened, but didn't think that she'd believe her. I told her she should use the name that the appointment was made under to call the cops about what had happened, but it turned out the wife had booked the appointment, so we decided to just let that moment of stupidity slip into the past. Casey and I are still best friends to this day, and I've always wanted to apologize to her for not doing anything, not saying anything. But the only times I've tried to bring it up, she brushes off the topic before I can tell her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, dude.
This is a story that I've wanted to share for a while. I'm 28 now, but this took place when I was 22. I'm 5'3" and had a really young-looking face that had me being mistaken for a 16-year-old often. It was December. My mother volunteered for the Feed the Children program. It's a charity that works to help poor families get food and presents for Christmas. I thought it would be fun, since I was a huge fan of Christmas and wanted to help out. So my mother signed me up. We both were so festive with our Christmas shirts and our silly reindeer headbands. For the morning routine, my mother did the hosting and greeted the families, while I was at the front desk having the families sign the application to list how many were in their household and such. And then, I would send them on their way to get their food and presents. Everything was going smoothly, and it was great to be hanging out with my fellow volunteers. By the time lunchtime was over, my mother and I had to switch the positions, so I took over as the host to welcome the guests. But this time, the crowds already slowed down, and I only got to greet a couple of families that came through the door. By then, most of the families already left, with only a handful still inside to gather the remaining food. Then I noticed a man walking over to me. He was tall, slim, Hispanic-looking with dark hair. He went over and told me he had some stuff from the event that he needed help to get into his car. He asked if I could help him. I was already feeling uncomfortable by him and his questions threw me off. I politely told him that I was unable to help because I needed to stay to greet the last of the families. I suggested that he could get some help from the army men that were also volunteering to help him take stuff to the car. They usually help people take their stuff. I would think it would end there, but the man insisted and asked me to take stuff to the car. I again told him I couldn't and just to ask the men for help. He seemed irritated by my reply and just walked away. I was so creeped out by it that I went over to tell my mother about what happened. She seemed also creeped out. She told me to just wait by the front desk, as she was finishing off her job. Luckily, it didn't take long, and we left soon after. Luckily, I didn't see him again. It still creeps me out, especially when he asked me repeatedly about helping to take stuff to his car. It was like he insisted on only I do it. There was a feeling that he may have thought I was younger. If so, why would he even ask me out of all the helpers here? I didn't see him go to anyone else. I've heard of stories of people offering their help like this, and then being hit over the head, forced into the vehicle, and never been seen again. Who knows what his true intentions were? Did I avoid a truly disturbing situation?
A few months ago, I was on my way to visit a friend who lived a few minutes away. It was dusk, so it wasn't entirely dark yet, and I haven't owned a car in years, so I was riding my motorcycle to meet her. About halfway there, my front headlight completely dies, and I'm left with no light but the small glow of my speedometer. At this point, I decide to try and make it back to my apartment before night completely falls and exit to turn around. But the traffic on the road, I don't make it far enough home. I'm close enough I recognize the area, but not close enough to try and walk the bike the few miles back. I ride through the dark and pull into a somewhat lit parking garage next to a restaurant, figuring I can call for a tow and grab something to eat while I wait. I park my bike and hang my helmet off the bar before doing the standard woman alone look around a mostly empty place. There's a few cars, but they're empty, and some of the lights are either flickering or completely out, and the path to the little hallway that leads up to the restaurant is completely black. I look to check my phone and lock my ignition, and out of the corner of my eye, I notice something in one of the flickers. But by the time I look up, nothing is there. At this point, the feeling in my stomach is twisting, and I'm slightly on edge. I look around again, staying on my bike while hoping I'm just being skittish, but nothing jumps out of the dark at me. I manage to slightly calm down and dial my insurance number, and after about 10 minutes, a wrecker is heading my way to arrive in about 30 or so minutes. As I go to step off my motorcycle, I get the feeling I'm being watched, and I start slowly scanning the parking garage again. Then, I see him. A moderately tall man, maybe about 200 or so pounds, standing on the edge of where the light stops. My first thought is a security guard or someone who just parked and is heading to the restaurant, but he just stands there, watching. As I try to head towards the hallway, he begins moving in the same direction. When I stop, so does he. I start to walk again, feeling vulnerable, so I reach for my purse to grab my keys. I just find empty air, and I see I've left my purse hanging from my handlebars. I turn to look at the stranger again, but he's gone. Now getting more than spooked, I power walk back and grab my purse, but when I turn around, I see his figure standing in the dark between me and the hallway. I step back and stand in the light next to my motorcycle before freezing and just fumbling with my purse trying to find anything to use as a weapon besides my keychain. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but I let my thumb hover over the call button, just waiting to see what he does. For what felt like an eternity, he just stands in the dark watching until a truck finally begins to pull into the garage. Before the headlights illuminate him, he slowly turns and walks off into the dark garage. The wrecker parks next to me and notices I look more than off, asking if I'd like to wait in the truck. Once I'm safely in and my bike is loaded on the back, I tell him what happened. Thankfully, that was the end of it, and I was dropped off safely where I live. But it still makes me shiver and really consider whether or not to ride at night.
This happened at the end of January 2019. I live near a small city in Germany, and I just finished my 3.5-year apprenticeship as an electrician. We were at the official ceremony in that city. and then went into a pub after to continue celebrating. My colleagues and me were drinking until 4 a.m. before I made my way home. I left the keys to my home in my car so that on my way home, I wanted to stop by my car to grab them. I started walking from the pub and noticed that 2 people were following me. I recognized their faces from the pub before, but I thought they maybe just needed to go the same way. It's a safe city, and I'm 6'5" and had never really had any problems with anyone from here. After another few hundred meters, I was pretty sure they were following me, and this was proven when the shortest began to shout and were basically next to me at this point. "Hey, who are you? Where are you going?" "I'm calling a taxi and gonna go home." "Where is that home?" "What are you doing here? We can wait for the taxi with you." "Sorry, I'm pretty tired and just want to go home. I don't really know you, so it doesn't really make sense for you to wait around with me." After that, the dude stopped at the crossing and I kept on walking. Just for drunk guy number 1 to run after me, grab my collar, raise his fist, and ask me something like, "What exactly is your plan for life? You tell me now exactly what you have planned in your life. I can take you to make a lot out of your life. We'll take you with us to Station 4, and they can show you how you can live your life." They showed me too. Even though I'm tall, I've never been into a fight and didn't really want to try on 2 guys at once for my first time. So basically started telling him my plans for life without details, trying to talk my way out of this situation. To my relief, the other drunk guy started telling drunk guy 1 that I have a plan for life and that we don't have to worry about him until the first guy gets loose of me and hugged me and wouldn't let go for about 20 minutes. I had 110, the German 911, typed in my phone but didn't really manage to call them. At the end, I managed to get home safely without much damage, and I guess it was just some misled soul that in his drunken mind thought he would help someone, but I'm pretty sure the encounter could have gone down a different path very quickly.
We were on a family holiday abroad years ago. I think I was 14 at the time. My sister's 16 at the time, and the toddler was our cousin. She was about maybe 2 years old, maybe a bit older. So we headed out during the evening to have dinner, and just after that we'll walk through the towns and maybe stop at a few bars for drinks. As we were walking through this town, a man who was, I'll say, badly dressed as a clown, approached my sister. Bear in mind, my sister is afraid of clowns, no matter how good or badly dressed they are. She was carrying our cousin on her hip, and the clown looked at our cousin and said hello to her, making her laugh as clowns do. My sister, on the other hand, just froze. I was standing by watching this happening, kind of laughing at the fact my sister was crapping herself. I was a savage sister. The next thing, without asking or anything, he takes my cousin from my sister, and then, of course, I thought, "Whoa, hey!" I shouted over to my parents and my aunt and uncle. My dad comes over and says, "Hey, what do you think you're doing with my niece?" as he was trying to get her back out of his arms. But when he tried to get her, the clown would just turn away or push my dad back. The clown says, "I thought you would like to take a photo. Do you not want to take a photo?" My aunt comes over, but scared out of her mind, thinking that clown's trying to kidnap her daughter. We all just gather around the clown, trying to pry my cousin from this clown's arms, but every time, he just kept pulling away or pushing us back. The next thing, my dad had enough. He approached the clown and said, "Let go of my niece, right now," grabbing him by the neck. In the end, he put her down. My dad picks her up and hands her to his sister-in-law. Then the guy just casually says, "Oh, okay, too bad. You don't want to take a photo," and hands my cousin a lollipop. We just headed back to the hotel and kinda thought nothing of it, but the next day we saw him again as we were at a restaurant. This time he took someone else's kid, like away from the parents, into some room. My dad spotted him as he came out of the toilets and stopped him, thinking he grabbed my cousin again. but it was someone else. But he headed back to the table and ate his dinner. Then for a second, he felt something wasn't right, so he went back to the clown's room. I didn't know what went down when he went back, but he came back out holding this other kid's hand and asked her where her parents were, assuming they were in the same restaurant. But nope, they weren't. They were at some other place. My dad took the kid back to her parents and said, "Don't let that clown anywhere near your kids," and told them what he tried to do with my cousin. I was kind of freaked out, thinking that this clown was probably a pedophile.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Midnight Researcher for joining us in tonight's video. If you enjoyed his narration, you'd probably enjoy his content, so feel free to check out the link in the description to watch more of what he does. There'll also be a link at the end. But for now, I just want to talk a little bit pertaining to the live stream we had the other day, or the video that some of you caught up on, should I say, and I'm going to add to that. So for the past 2 days, I've actually been looking into how to improve the channel. So, you know, the time I'm not uploading isn't wasted, don't get me wrong. So the first place I thought I'd look is comparing myself to the other horror narrators and see what they actually do, where I can improve, see the things that they do that, you know, I think maybe I can try some of these things for myself. I'm not stealing ideas, I'm just seeing where to improve. So, you know, don't think I'm doing that, because I'm not. And one thing really made me a bit upset. And that's that not only have I noticed that some people who used to just tell horror stories have now, like, changed their dynamic. Like, Lazy Masquerade used to tell horror stories. I mean, he did, like, one video the other day. And Corpse just does gaming now. And a few other prominent people who used to be in the community, who I've since forgotten about, have gone, or have changed what they do. And it's made me feel a bit sad. I even looked at, like, some mid-tier channels that used to do okay, and, you know, they just kind of, like, have disappeared. You know, people like Insomniac, you know, like not Creepy Blonde Girl, although I think she's stopped as well. Black Eyed Blonde, you know, she's completely stopped, I think, or near enough. And there are just so many people in the horror narration channel that are just in the horror narration community that have just kind of stopped or changed. And so I looked at who the biggest people were, and of course it's Mr. Nightmare, who's in a league of his own. And then it's just like Let's Read, Be Buster, Darkness Prevails, Being Scared, me, you know, like Swamp Dweller, Southern Cannibal, Raven Reads, and a few other channels out there. And it really started to dawn on me that there aren't that many of us left, you know, like of the larger channels. I know there are always new ones coming up, and I think that's brilliant to keep the community going. But when I saw their views, because I've got a little tool on TubeBuddy that lets you compare your graphs, you know, comparing my views to some of the other big creators, like, they weren't too dissimilar. Like, B-Buster's uploading only once a week now, and, like, not on average, I'm getting a little bit more views than him per month. But, you know, he only uploads 4 videos, so it's not hard to do when you upload as many as I did. And, you know, like, I think it's the same with most of us. Like, me and Being Scared are getting roughly the same. Let's Read, of course, is getting more, but he's got a bigger fan base and he posts very frequently too. And it's just got me a bit disheartened, because I don't know for sure, but it would appear that we're just not growing as a community, as a collective, very big. Like, I don't know how to express it. I'm a bit disheartened because I feel like the platform isn't pushing out horror as much as it is, for example, true crime. Loads of true crime creators come out of nowhere and grow really fast, and that's great, but where's the true horror story love, you know? And it got me feeling a bit down, really, because I obviously, as you imagine, I put so much effort into this channel. I really want it to flourish, and I was doing the maths, and I average about 4,000 subs, if I'm lucky, a month, which I haven't even been doing for the past 3 months. And if you take that, times it by 12, you get about 48. So let's just round it off at an even 50. 50 a year, and I'm not even on 300 yet. That's going to take me, 14 years roughly to get to 1 million subs? And I'm not trying to say that my only goal is 1 million subs, of course not. But it's a dream I have. And I've been growing at 4K a month for roughly the past 4 years since I started daily. And I thought that it would go up from that, but it never has. And, well, I'm just a bit disappointed because I've noticed that other people haven't, exploded either. And it's really got me thinking, maybe it's not me. Maybe I'm doing things okay. Obviously can do better, but I'm doing things okay. Maybe it's just there's not much exposure for the community as a whole. And it just got me wondering, why is that? Well, how could that be? And I remember something that Rob Gavigan said a few years ago, where he said that YouTube just doesn't like the community. And I didn't believe it at first, but perhaps it's true. I don't know. These are just my ramblings. Yeah, I've got a whole list of things that people do that I like, other creators, and I might try and do a few of them. There's a lot on the list, but yeah, I'm not, just testing out things. I'll be doing that in the next few days. So yeah, sorry for the kind of sadness rant. If anyone wants to talk about it with me, feel free in the description. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm just sorry, guys. I want to get back to really good, really scheduled, really great uploads. I'm just really focusing on how to improve the channel right now. So if the times they launch, which they haven't been great in the past, but if the time they launch is a bit uneven, then I'm sorry about that. I'm going to wrap things up now, guys. I really hope you guys have a wonderful night. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.